The air in the alley always tasted like spent brass and old rain when Silas Vance finished a job. He didn't just kill, he erased. For 2 decades, operating in the subterranean world of New York's organized crime, Silas had earned his moniker, the Razor, for the surgical precision and absolute finality of his work. His ledger was written entirely in closed cases, pristine and absolute. There were no witnesses, no loose ends, and most importantly, no misses. In the treacherous ecosystem of Harlem's numbers and narcotics, where Frank Lucas reigned supreme, a kingdom built on the unprecedented purity of the blue magic heroin smuggled directly from Southeast Asia, Silas Vance was the ultimate warranty. He was the silent mechanism of divine retribution that Lucas deployed only when all other remedies failed, when the betrayal was so deep, so existential, that only annihilation would suffice. Other hitmen relied on brutality or luck. Silas relied on data and detachment. He was a perfect machine of calculated death, impervious to sentiment, fear, or hesitation. He was the one man Lucas trusted implicitly to protect the sanctity of his empire, because Silas Vance understood the first rule of the game: survival mandates perfection. It was 1973. The brownstone on West 114th Street was Lucas's sanctuary, guarded by men whose faces were as hard and unforgiving as the cobblestones beneath their feet. The atmosphere inside was rarely this chilled. Silas was called in, a rare occurrence that signaled a matter of paramount, existential threat. Usually the orders came through a disposable runner, a layer of insulation meant to keep the boss clean. But tonight, Silas was ushered directly into the presence of the king. Frank Lucas sat behind a monolithic desk of dark mahogany, the surface bare except for a single slim manila folder. The air was thick with the faint scent of expensive Cuban tobacco and the unspoken threat of violence. Lucas looked cold, his face carved granite, etched deeper than usual with stress. "Silas," Lucas began, his voice low, resonating with a dangerous calm that often preceded catastrophic fury. "They hit us. Not the cops, not the Italians. Inside, the worst kind of hit. Someone had done the unforgivable. They had stolen a consignment of the purest stock, the Bicentennial Blue, a package so large its absence left a crater in the foundation of the empire. This wasn't merely theft. It was a declaration of war by someone who knew the weaknesses of the fortress. The amount stolen was sufficient to fund a rival operation capable of challenging Lucas's dominance on the entire Eastern Seaboard. "Who?" Silas asked, his voice a gravelly whisper, emotionless. He didn't ask how or why. Those were concerns for the foot soldiers. His concern was the singular identity needed to fulfill the execution order. Lucas pushed the file forward, slowly, deliberately. The simple movement felt weighted with consequence. A ghost, a high-ranking lieutenant, someone we trusted, who had access to the deep channels. They sold their soul for enough money to disappear forever, but they didn't disappear fast enough. They are scheduled to meet a buyer, a very large buyer, in 2 days. Washington Heights. If that sale goes through, we bleed out slowly. That cannot happen. This is not a warning shot, Silas. This is an execution order meant to terrify every rat who even thinks about lifting a penny from my coffers." Silas reached out and took the file. It was heavier than usual, almost as if the paper stock had absorbed the weight of the crime itself. The instructions were vague on the how. Silas never needed instructions on methodology, but absolute on the WHO. The target was elusive, moving with the paranoia of someone who understood exactly what Frank Lucas was capable of unleashing. As Silas began to turn toward the door, Lucas called his name back, softer this time. "Silas, look me in the eye." Silas turned. Lucas's eyes, usually sharp and piercing, held a flicker of something unreadable. Not sadness, perhaps just profound regret. "When you accept this, there are no contingencies, no delays, no room for error. This must be the cleanest job you've ever done. And when it's over, no one breathes the name of the victim. Understood?" "Understood," Silas confirmed, the words sealed with the absolute finality of an iron door slamming shut. Why did Lucas look away just as Silas affirmed the mandate? The subtle breach of Lucas's usual hard gaze was the only open loop Silas registered, a minor tremor that he dismissed instantly. Lucas was human, after all, burdened by the necessary cruelty of command. Silas, however, was not. Silas retreated to his operational hub, a nondescript, reinforced loft in Hell's Kitchen, equipped with communication intercepts and surveillance gear that felt decades ahead of its time. He meticulously spread the contents of the file. The initial reconnaissance reports detailed the target's movements. complex, unpredictable, demonstrating a thorough knowledge of counter-surveillance techniques. This wasn't some street punk. This was a professional, trained in the Lucas School of Operational Security. The documents revealed the target's current hideout, a dilapidated, structurally unsound warehouse overlooking the Harlem River, perfect for a quick escape via water or the labyrinthine underbelly of the city's dockyard. The meet time was fixed. 03 hours, 2 nights from now. Silas began his preparation. His methodology was his armor. He didn't rely on luck. He relied on geometry, acoustics, psychology, and the absolute predictability of human greed. First, the gear. He selected the rifle, his favored tool for distance erasure. A customized Remington Model 700, chambered in 30-06 Springfield, meticulously maintained and tuned for absolute accuracy at extreme ranges. He checked the scope, tested the trigger pull, a hair trigger adjusted to break crisply at precisely 2 pounds of pressure. Every bullet was hand-loaded, the brass polished, the powder weighed down to the granule. This level of obsessive detail ensured that his variables were zeroed out. Next, surveillance. He spent the entire first day observing the perimeter of the warehouse from 3 different, meticulously chosen vantage points. He noted the patrol patterns of the local police, sparse, predictable, easily avoided. He catalogued the flow of river traffic. He analyzed the prevailing wind currents at 03 hours. He built a 3-dimensional mental map of the interior, based on architectural blueprints acquired through channels Lucas had cultivated over years of corrupting municipal planning officials. Silas Vance was an artist of negative space. He studied the life the target was trying to live, the space the target was trying to enter, and then he positioned himself in the one place the target could not evade, turning the target's ambition into their final coffin. During the long, cold hours of silent observation, a pattern interrupt occurred, a slight break in Silas's usual vacuum of emotion. He permitted himself a rare moment of reflection, recognizing the target's skill. This required exceptional boldness. To steal from Lucas was suicide, yet the target had acted, driven by a monumental arrogance that defied death. This arrogance reminded Silas of his own early years in the criminal landscape, a raw, brutal ambition that had been surgically excised by the necessary pragmatism of survival under Lucas. He remembered the first kill he executed for Lucas, a job that secured his loyalty forever. A rival drug boss in the Bronx, operating with sloppy methods. Silas had done the job with such cold efficiency, such lack of visible pleasure or pain, that Lucas saw not a killer, but a mechanism. Lucas had understood that Silas wasn't motivated by money or sadism. He was motivated by the perfection of the task. That was the essence of the razor. He was entirely focused on the clean line. Every kill since then had only reinforced the legend. He never missed. The anticipation of this specific job, however, felt different. It was cleaner, higher stakes, but there was an unusual void. Usually there was a certain mathematical satisfaction in confirming the geometry of the shot. This time, it was just dreadfully cold. He chalked it up to the sheer visibility of the target. A high-level defector meant that the repercussions of failure would be instant and terminal. The city was a grid of potential deaths, and Silas Vance was the apex predator, moving toward a kill mandate that carried the weight of Frank Lucas's entire empire. The pressure was immense, but for Silas, pressure only refined the cut. The night arrived, draped in a heavy, damp fog rolling in off the river, exactly as Silas had predicted, based on the atmospheric pressure reading. The fog was a double-edged sword. It would obscure his position, but also slightly distort the long-range visibility for the kill shot. He adjusted his calculated trajectory for the anticipated humidity and slight refraction. He was positioned half a mile away, in the gutted shell of an abandoned gasometer, offering a clean, unobstructed line of sight through a narrow, pre-cut vent hole. The cold steel of the Remington was comforting against his cheek. He breathed slowly, regulating his heart rate, pushing his entire being into a state of suspended animation, where only the optic nerve and the trigger finger remained active. At 0250, the first vehicle arrived. A long, black Cadillac Seville, the type favored by major dealers and power brokers, pulled up sharply, its headlights cutting briefly through the gloom before being extinguished. 3 heavily armed men spilled out, establishing a protective perimeter. They were not Lucas's men. These were the buyers, professional, cautious, ready for trouble. At 0258, the second vehicle appeared, a battered, nondescript panel van perfectly blending with the industrial debris of the docklands. It backed up to the main loading door of the warehouse. Silas focused his scope. The range was exactly 880 yards. The trajectory was perfect. He could already hear the low metallic scrape of the warehouse door being raised. This was the critical moment. The target would only be visible for a few seconds during the transfer of the stolen goods. The shot had to be taken while the target was standing, exposed, under the single, weak fluorescent bulb that illuminated the loading bay. A figure emerged from the driver's side of the panel van. He was tall, dressed in high-quality leather, moving with a confident swagger that betrayed none of the desperate anxiety expected of a man who had betrayed the deadliest drug lord in America. Silas's world narrowed to the crosshairs. He saw the target lift his head, scanning the dark perimeter, settling his features into the aggressive negotiation mask required for the impending transaction. Silas inhaled, slowly, deeply. He held the breath, the customary pause before the execution. His finger moved to the trigger, settling into the familiar, precise resistance of the 2-pound pull. The target stepped fully into the pool of dim, sickly yellow light. Silas focused the scope, adjusting the magnification for the final clarity. He saw the face, the facial structure, the familiar set of the jaw, the sharp, almost arrogant curve of the nose. Then, he saw the scar, just above the left eyebrow, a jagged white line, distinctive and unmistakable. The scar was one he knew intimately, because he himself had given it to the boy during a rough, playful sparring session decades ago, back when the world was smaller, and their bond was defined by shared blood and loyalty. The name flashed through Silas's memory, an unwelcome, screaming intruder shattering the perfect silence of the kill zone. Jericho Vance, his younger cousin. The boy he had practically raised after their mothers died. The man Lucas had insisted was merely a high-ranking lieutenant, a deliberate, insidious misdirection to ensure Silas would perform the hit without question. The man who was currently holding a king's ransom in stolen heroin, and the man Silas was now tasked with annihilating. The surgical machinery of Silas Vance stopped. The trigger finger froze, paralyzed not by fear or doubt, but by the devastating intrusion of memory and blood. Kinship was the one variable Lucas had shielded from the calculation, and it was the one variable that brought the perfect operation to a screeching, horrific halt. The razor had missed his first shot, not because of a technical failure, but because the calculus of cold execution had been overridden by the irreversible, burning math of family. Silas found himself staring down the sight of his rifle at the only remaining piece of family he had in the world. He had 2 seconds before Jericho moved, 2 seconds before the buyers noticed the delay, 2 seconds before the opportunity vanished. The moment stretched, distorting time into a suffocating pressure cooker of conflicting loyalties. The man who never missed now had a decision that would redefine his life and the hierarchy of Harlem. What choice could Silas make? Knowing Frank Lucas would accept nothing less than Jericho's death, and knowing that every second of hesitation sealed Silas's own fate. The answer to the impossible dilemma, the shattering consequence of the razor's sudden humanity, lies in part 2. The meticulous calibration of the man's mind was his weapon, more lethal than any custom-built instrument he carried. He moved through the periphery of Harlem not as a presence, but as an absence, a void in the sensory input of the city. He had executed the calculus of clean erasure hundreds of times, and each calculation returned the same irrefutable answer: perfect silence, perfect severance. The assignment handed down by Lucas had been sparse, its secrecy its primary characteristic. A cancer in the ledger, Lucas had hissed, the ice in his voice colder than the winter air outside. Someone who knows where the foundation stones are buried. You cut them out, clean, fast. I don't want history, I want absence. The target, currently designated only by a pattern of movement and a vague physical profile, had become the sole focus of his existence. For 3 days, the killer had lived in the spectral dimension between observation and action, observing the rot he was tasked to excise. This wasn't a rival crew member or an errant junkie. This was high-level internal failure. The target maintained a low profile, but with a telling arrogance, the kind of carelessness that only comes from years of believing oneself untouchable, insulated by layers of trust that only Lucas himself could have peeled back. This person was educated, resourceful, and crucially, operating with the intimate knowledge of the entire organization's weaknesses. They were a sophisticated ghost. The Hitman specialized in ghosts. He had selected his perch 5 blocks away, utilizing a vacant, condemned brownstone that offered an unbroken sightline down the target's daily route, a route that inexplicably led to a tiny, obscure jazz club on 131st Street every afternoon at precisely 4:15 p.m. This regularity felt dissonant. A smart operative, one who had stolen millions and risked the wrath of the biggest operation north of the Mason-Dixon line, should not possess a predictable rhythm. It was either a trap or astonishing complacency. He opted for the latter because arrogance always precedes the fall, especially in Lucas's work. He laid out his tools on a weathered piece of canvas, treating the procedure with the solemnity of a high priest preparing for sacrifice. The rifle, heavy and true, was custom-chambered, suppressed to mere whispers, designed to ensure that the sound of the shell casing hitting the pavement was louder than the discharge. Every component was sterile, precise, and absolute. As he waited, the periphery began to blur. His vision narrowed, the world outside the scope dissolving into noise and color. Only the trajectory, the wind speed, the angle of the sun, and the eventual impact point mattered. He checked his timepiece. 4 minutes until the window opened. This job felt different, though he ruthlessly suppressed the thought. There was a ghost in the machine of his concentration, a flicker of something familiar in the way the target carried themselves during the initial surveillance, a peculiar tension in the shoulder blades, a certain way they leaned against a lamppost waiting for a taxi. It was the echo of a memory long buried, a pattern interrupt he usually erased instantly. But tonight, it persisted, a faint, metallic taste in the back of his throat. He chalked it up to fatigue, the psychological strain of waiting for the moment of total commitment. The pressure to maintain his perfect record, his earned reputation as the one man who simply did not miss, was immense. Failure here meant not only professional ruin, but likely a torturous death, orchestrated by the very man who hired him. He inhaled deeply, the scent of mildew and damp plaster filling his lungs. Steeling himself, the mechanism of his certainty clicked into place. Lucas's interests were his own. The target was nothing but a vector for chaos, a necessary termination. 4:15. The target emerged from the side street, exactly on schedule, head bent slightly against the weak afternoon light. They wore a tailored coat, nondescript and expensive, blending perfectly into the upscale side of the neighborhood Lucas controlled. The hitman brought the scope up, the glass cool against his brow. The crosshairs found the occipital lobe, the precise spot where the central nervous system could be instantly severed, ensuring absolute silence. The target raised a hand to shield their eyes for a moment, and then paused, reaching into their coat pocket. This was the moment of total clarity, the eye of the storm. The professional killer saw the world in high definition. Every pore, every wrinkle, every minute tremor of the target's hand was visible. The target pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and began to flip through it while walking. A dangerous thing to do in public, especially if those pages contained the names and numbers that had put this execution order in motion. The hitman's finger tightened on the trigger, the pressure building evenly. 2 more steps, and the target would clear the shadow cast by the awning, placing them perfectly in the golden light, the ideal canvas for the final brushstroke. Then, the target stopped. They didn't look up, didn't sense the danger, but simply paused, perhaps irritated by a specific entry in the notebook. They took off their leather glove, a small, unnecessary movement that became monumental under the scrutiny of the scope. The sunlight hit the target's left hand directly, illuminating it with shocking clarity. The trigger pressure released fractionally, not consciously, but instinctively, a reflex born not of professional caution, but of profound, terrifying recognition. The hitman fought the involuntary slackening, commanding his index finger to continue the movement, to fulfill the contract, to maintain the professional perfect vacuum of his existence. But the image burned itself into his retinas, overriding decades of training and disciplined detachment. It wasn't the target's face that caused the sudden, paralyzing stasis. The face was indeed a handsome, sophisticated stranger, though marked by the faint, distinctive family bone structure he had seen in distant photographs. It was the ring. It sat heavy and undeniable on the target's ring finger, a grotesque anachronism against the tailored sophistication of the coat and the expensive leather notebook. It was not a stylish piece of jewelry. It was old, thick, tarnished silver, deeply engraved with 3 interlocking symbols, a cryptic sigil unique to his mother's family line, a matriarchal heirloom that was supposed to have vanished when his own mother died decades ago, a piece of history so personal, so deeply rooted in the soil of their shared lineage, that its presence here was not coincidence, but condemnation. The hitman's breath hitched, shallow and sharp, The world did not dissolve into noise. It crystallized into an unbearable silence, punctuated only by the frantic, sickening rhythm of his own heart pounding against his ribs. He lowered the rifle barrel a mere inch, enough to shift the crosshairs from the center of the target's brain to the empty space of the sidewalk beside their foot. The action was purely defensive, a mechanism to ensure the weapon did not discharge prematurely, a catastrophic failure that would end not one life, but two, in horrifying public spectacle. He forced his eye away from the scope, tearing his focus back to the gritty, mildew-stained reality of the abandoned room. Sweat, cold and sudden, plastered his shirt to his back. The internal monologue, usually a disciplined stream of technical command, fractured into shards of raw, visceral terror and disbelief. Impossible. He scanned his memory banks, the cold, efficient archives of his mind. He had left that life behind. He had systematically burned every bridge, excised every memory, changed his name and his location multiple times over 2 decades to become the silent killer Luke required. He had done it specifically to ensure that the shadow world and the ghosts of his childhood never intersected. Yet, here was undeniable proof that the past had not just caught up, it had walked directly into his crosshairs, wearing the silver symbol of his kin. The target, still engrossed in their notebook, was perhaps 15 seconds from moving out of the optimal kill window. 15 seconds until the opportunity was lost, until the contract was irrevocably broken. The hitman realized 2 things simultaneously, and both truths were equally shattering. First, the target was undeniably, irrevocably family, not a distant relative, but a direct blood relation. The resemblance was now overwhelming, manifesting in the sharp line of the jaw, the curve of the ear, details he had dismissed as generic echoes during his detached surveillance. This was blood. Perhaps a cousin he had last seen when they were both children playing hide-and-seek in the dusty back roads of North Carolina, before life and the desperation of the city had consumed them both. Second, Frank Lucas knew, or perhaps Lucas did not know, which was almost worse. If Lucas had simply given him the name and failed to recognize the connection, it was a terrible accident, a random collision in the dark. But if Lucas had known and had deliberately assigned the hitman to execute his own kin, then the mission was not merely an execution, but a test of loyalty so profound and perverse that it transcended the bounds of organized crime. It was a declaration of ownership over the hitman's very soul. The hitman didn't know which outcome was more terrifying. If it was an accident, he had violated the contract and failed the most powerful man in the city. If it was deliberate, Lucas had just painted a target on the hitman's own back, testing whether the bond of blood was stronger than the bond of silver and fear. The answer, in this moment of paralyzed horror, was clear. Blood held the advantage. The target closed the notebook, slipped it back into the coat, and finally looked up, scanning the street with a practiced, furtive glance that bespoke caution, though they looked directly at the hitman's hiding spot without seeing him. The moment of maximum vulnerability passed. The target moved on, disappearing around the corner towards the jazz club. The window was closed. The contract was breached. The perfect record, maintained through years of surgical efficiency and ethical vacuum, was broken by a silver ring and a ghost from the past. The rifle clattered softly against the wooden floorboard as the hitman released it. The sound was deafening in the suddenly small room. He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to burn the image of the ring away, to restore the sterile clarity of the mission, but the knowledge had taken root like a malignancy. He was no longer the hunter. He was compromised, exposed, and suddenly burdened by an impossible choice. He had spared the target, preserving a familial link he thought extinct, but in doing so, he had placed himself directly in the center of Lucas's terrifying glare. His training demanded immediate action, eliminate the target and secure his position. But his gut, a primitive instrument he rarely consulted, screamed a warning. If you kill them now, you kill the only connection left to who you once were. You confirm Lucas's control. He scrambled backward, crawling away from the window, the need for immediate escape overwhelming everything else. He needed to disappear from this location, this neighborhood, this city, and begin the impossible task of retroactive research. He needed to know the target's name, their history, their exact relationship to him, and crucially, what they knew about Lucas that warranted a death sentence passed down through the hands of kin. The meticulous professionalism that had defined his life now turned into hyper-efficient paranoia. Every muscle taut, he packed the rifle with frantic speed, wrapping the custom weapon in the canvas like a shroud. He moved towards the rear exit, the fear now not of failure, but of consequence. He realized the terrible symmetry of the situation. Lucas hadn't just given him a target, he had given him a key that unlocked the very past the hitman had sworn to bury. The man who never missed had been stopped, not by skill or caution, but by the relentless, cruel coincidence of fate. The execution had been aborted, but the game had just begun. The rules were rewritten, and the stakes were no longer about money or power, but about the survival of the bloodline. He exited the building through a service alley, merging with the grime and shadow of the late afternoon. His next move was critical. He couldn't just vanish. Lucas would view flight as admission of guilt. He had to gain intelligence, confirm the identity, and find out how deep this treachery ran, both in his family and in the operation. He had one immediate, dangerous advantage. Lucas currently believed the job was done, or soon would be. That gave him a temporal window of maybe 24 hours, 48 at most, before the lack of confirmation would trigger Lucas's infamous swift suspicion. He was running blind, haunted by the silver ring and the terrifying suspicion that his perfect employer might have knowingly orchestrated the ultimate, brutal act of psychological warfare against his most valuable asset. The hunter had spared the quarry. Now he needed to know if he was running toward freedom or straight into a far more intricate personal trap laid by the master of the operation himself. The clock had started ticking on the life of Frank Lucas's deadliest hitman. He needed answers, and he needed them before the sun rose again, because the failure to pull the trigger meant he had just signed his own death warrant. The silence was the loudest sound he had ever known, a shrieking, deafening vacuum where the perfect certainty of the kill had once resided. The pressure plate on the trigger guard felt volcanic beneath his fingertip, yet the final millimeter of depression was impossible, locked by an internal mechanism far older and more formidable than any safety catch on a weapon forged in war. This was not simply hesitation, it was ontological collapse. The world, previously ordered by the clean, sharp parameters of targets and asset, had suddenly dissolved into the soft, terrifying chaos of memory and blood. The man sitting oblivious at the mahogany table, reviewing manifest papers under the sterile glow of a chandelier, was Michael. Not the target, not the threat, not the required elimination, but Michael. The small, barely noticeable scar above the left eyebrow, a souvenir from a poorly executed bicycle jump in the summer of 1978. The slight nervous habit of running his index finger along his lower lip when concentrating, a tic acquired during late-night poker games in their grandfather's dusty parlor. These were not generic identifiers. They were the fundamental, irrefutable markers of a shared genesis, markers the assassin had spent 20 years brutally erasing from his own identity. He knew the chairman, Frank Lucas's shadow, known simply as the chairman within the inner circle, specialized in cruel efficiency. The chairman measured success not by body count, but by the emotional distance achieved from the act. Yet, why this specific target? The assassin's mind, usually a high-speed calculator processing variables of wind, trajectory, and escape routes, was now agonizingly slow, replaying every moment since he accepted the contract. He had checked the package, the photos, the dossier, all meticulously crafted to portray a high-level rival named Marcus Thorne, leveraging assets and political connections the chairman needed eliminated before the next financial quarter. Marcus Thorne was a phantom. Michael, his cousin, was the reality. The assassin was frozen in the geometry of death. He was the most effective ghost the Underworld had ever manufactured, defined solely by the impeccable, unbroken chain of successes. A miss was unthinkable. A retreat was impossible, but executing this order meant severing the last, frail cord connecting him to humanity, and paradoxically, assuring that Lucas had finally eliminated the very last sliver of the man who existed before the ghost. The realization hit him with the force of a high-caliber round. Lucas had known. Lucas, with his sprawling intelligence network rooted deep in the rural South, had absolutely known that Marcus Thorne was family. This wasn't merely a contract, it was a final, terrible test of absolute soulless loyalty, designed to force the assassin to execute his own past. 90 seconds. That was the window. The perimeter patrol would complete its sweep of the roof garden in precisely 88 seconds, standard operating procedure for this downtown penthouse security. He had to act, but the action could no longer be the kill. He slid the rifle back into its custom foam housing, the slick, oily sound of metal against polymer echoing deafeningly in his ears. The switch was agonizing. The ghost had never transitioned from offensive posture to defensive extraction without eliminating the threat first. His body screamed in protest. unused to this sudden, self-imposed failure. He moved with the practiced, soundless fluidity of a predator whose prey has suddenly become its dependent. Abandoning the planned entry point, he scaled the sheer brick wall of the adjoining building, utilizing the narrow, almost invisible ventilation seams and the structural anchors hidden beneath the ivy. He had designed this complex's vulnerabilities into his escape protocol years ago, not realizing he would one day use them to save, not sacrifice, a life. He dropped onto the terrace balcony adjoining Michael's penthouse study. The glass, 3-inch thick, ballistic-rated fortress pane, was irrelevant. He extracted a thermal charge the size of a cigarette pack, placing it precisely on the frame where the structural stresses met the locking mechanism. Click. A quick burst of focused heat, invisible to IR sensors, and the glass dissolved its molecular grip on the frame. He slid the pane inward, moving the heavy glass as if it were tissue paper. Michael looked up, alerted not by sound, but by the subtle, imperceptible drop in air pressure. His eyes, the same shade of deep brown as their grandmother's, widened in confused terror. He saw the black silhouette, the surgical gloves, the cold, expressionless face of a man who looked like an abstract rendering of death. "Stay silent," the assassin hissed, his voice a low, mechanical rasp, unused to human articulation. "Don't scream. Don't move. I am not here to hurt you. I am here to extract you." Michael, a high-level accountant whose world was spreadsheets and corporate tax law, was paralyzed by primal fear. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling breath emerged. The assassin didn't have time for negotiation. Lucas's surveillance system, always active, would log the structural anomaly soon. He pulled a specialized auto-injector, filled not with a paralytic, but with a rapid-acting synthetic adenosine cocktail, a drug designed to simulate catastrophic cardiac arrest without causing permanent damage. "Forgive me, Michael," he whispered, injecting the serum into his cousin's carotid artery. Michael gasped, the rapid onset of the artificial circulatory shock mimicking a sudden, overwhelming heart attack. He convulsed, clutching his chest, his eyes rolling back as he slumped unconscious onto the polished floor, papers scattering around him. The staging was crucial. The ghost had to disappear, but the target had to appear successfully eliminated. He quickly located Michael's desk phone and used a small proprietary device to override the dialing sequence, initiating a distressed call to 911 about severe chest pain, a call that would be automatically disconnected 2 seconds later, leaving a ghost signal in the record. He scattered 3 prescription bottles, aspirin, an old beta blocker Michael genuinely used, and a bottle of expensive champagne, half drunk and tipped over. The scene suggested a high-stress businessman collapsing from overwork and a sudden fatal heart incident while celebrating an achievement. It was tidy, conventional, and crucially non-violent, protecting the integrity of the ghost's modus operandi. But he still needed to buy time. He moved to the small server closet hidden behind a bookshelf, using a tiny, focused electromagnetic pulse device. He didn't destroy the main hub. That would signal a deliberate breach. Instead, he corrupted the timestamps on the local surveillance logs, advancing the timestamp by exactly 6 hours, rendering the last 6 hours of footage internally inconsistent and requiring a mandatory manual override and repair, a delay of at least 2 hours before the recorded footage could be reviewed by Lucas's technicians. With Michael slung over his shoulder, he utilized the building's maintenance infrastructure, the narrow unlit tunnels reserved for HVAC and high-tension wiring. The air was thick with dust and the metallic scent of ozone. Every step was a calculated risk. He was carrying the single greatest liability in his 20-year career, and he was doing it willingly. As they moved deeper into the labyrinthine service level, Michael began to stir, the synthetic crisis receding. He was groggy, disoriented, the fear replaced by bone-deep confusion. Who are you? What did you do to me?" Michael croaked, his voice weak. The assassin lowered him onto a pile of discarded insulation material. He pulled down the tactical mask just enough for Michael to see the familiar set of the jaw, the severe lines around the eyes. The ghost, now just the man who used to be his cousin. Michael stared, horror graduating to absolute comprehension. "Dear God, it's you. After all these years, you were supposed to kill me, weren't you?" Lucas ordered it. "He did," the assassin confirmed, his voice devoid of warmth. "But why, Michael? Why the elaborate false identity? What threat were you to him?" Michael coughed, clutching his chest, forcing himself to breathe. "Not me. The ledgers. The original ledgers from the 90s. The ones detailing the laundering operation through the shipping manifests. They were sealed, buried deep in the Swiss accounts under the name of Marcus Thorne Trust. I was the only one who could access them, the only one who knew the trigger phrase. The revelation was seismic. Lucas hadn't just been eliminating a rival, he was burning the evidence of his earliest and most dangerous crimes, crimes that could link him directly to high-ranking political figures, and by using the assassin, he had guaranteed the absolute destruction of that evidence, regardless of the assassin's success or failure. If the ghost succeeded, the proof vanished. If he failed, the ghost vanished too, eliminating the one man whose historical knowledge of the organization, combined with the familial tie to Michael, made him the next logical threat once the target was known. Lucas played a game of simultaneous checkmate. He intended for us both to disappear tonight, the assassin concluded, the cold logic returning, overlaying the shame. He leveraged the blood. He knew I'd recognize you, or at least he banked on the possibility that I would falter. Why didn't you falter before? Michael asked, tears starting to trace clean paths through the dust on his face. The assassin didn't answer directly. We move. Now. He will know the collapse was faked within the hour. Once his internal team bypasses the corrupted timestamp, he will not wait for the autopsy. The transition was immediate. The ghost, the perfect killer, was dead. He was replaced by a hunted survivalist, relying on contingency plans designed for a life he had never expected to live, a life outside the chairman's orbit. He guided Michael through the subterranean arteries of the city. He abandoned his primary safe house, knowing they would be scorched earth within minutes. He used the emergency cash drops reserved for deep infiltration missions, small, untraceable caches of currency, passports, and minimal supplies buried in forgotten urban ruins. He had planned for every contingency of failure except for this one, the failure of his own absolute commitment to murder. The extraction was brutal, requiring them to cross 3 major communication conduits and navigate a forgotten municipal water drainage system. The journey was a physical manifestation of their new reality, dirty, cold, and utterly removed from the luxurious world they had both occupied, one as a fixer, the other as a puppet accountant. The assassin had to sacrifice every digital trace of the ghost. He destroyed the encrypted burner phones, physically incinerated the biometric data stored in his concealed wristband, and initiated a self-destruct sequence on his offshore accounts, erasing decades of accumulated wealth. A sacrifice meant to create maximal noise and minimal trail. He wasn't just erasing a life, he was attempting to erase a legend, throwing the chairman's powerful investigative machine into informational overload. They emerged hours later, miles away, near the desolate waterfront docks, where the smell of oil and salt dominated the air. Dawn was breaking, an indifferent pale light that illuminated the exhaustion and the terror etched onto Michael's face, and the unfamiliar, weary resignation on the assassin. Where do we go? Michael whispered, shivering, the synthetic drug finally fully metabolized, leaving him weak. Away from the known path, the assassin stated, pulling the hood of a borrowed cheap utility jacket over his head. His eyes scanned the horizon, noting the lack of movement, the absence of any immediate threat, a silence that was more terrifying than any confrontation. The absence of immediate pursuit meant Lucas was confident. He didn't need to chase them yet, because he knew where they couldn't go. He won't stop, Michael. He is defined by control. This failure is a wound he cannot abide. I know, the assassin replied simply, and now he knows I am defined by something other than his control. That is the leverage we possess. The legend of the ghost, the perfect killer who never missed, the shadow who executed without conscience, had died on the trigger of a silenced rifle, killed by a ghost from the past. He was now just a man, burdened by the heavy responsibility of protecting his only remaining family, and perpetually hunted by the most efficient criminal organization in the country, led by the one man who understood exactly how vulnerable a perfect killer becomes the moment he allows himself to. Their existence was now a perpetual motion, a forced pilgrimage across the edges of society. The ghost was gone, replaced by a fugitive who had made the single, fatal mistake of choosing blood over the code, and for that, the price would be exacted every single day until their final breath. The pursuit was just beginning, and they were the targets of a massive, silent operation executed by the very infrastructure the assassin had helped build. The assassin checked the empty street one last time. There was no safety, only movement. He placed a steadying hand on Michael's shoulder, a gesture of unexpected warmth. We start walking, he commanded, and we never look back. If you found yourself captivated by the complex loyalties and brutal choices that define the underworld, and you are ready to delve deeper into the forgotten history and high-stakes double crosses of the organized crime world, ensure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. We are just beginning to scratch the surface of the silent wars fought in the shadows, and your continued engagement fuels the revelation of these untold stories.